On the night of June 1, 2026, the Vatican was almost completely silent. But what lay inside the papal apartment would soon break that silence across the entire Catholic world. On a simple desk inside the Apostolic Palace, a single document waited under dim light. It was only 3 pages long, with no cover letter, no explanation, and none of the careful language the Vatican usually used to soften the impact of major decisions. At the top of that document, one word had been stamped in red ink: cold, administrative, and final in tone: reassignment. Inside those pages were 12 names, not assistants or minor staff, but senior officials of the Roman Curia, archbishops, bishops, and monsignors who had spent years, in some cases decades, building influence inside the Church's governing system. These were men who controlled departments, budgets, diplomatic channels, doctrinal decisions, internal investigations, and the quiet mechanisms that allowed the Vatican to function as one of the most powerful institutions in the world, without revealing how its power truly operated. Pope Leo XIV stood near the window of the papal apartment, looking out over St. Peter's Square as the lights of Rome shimmered in the distance. The document was in his hand. He had already read it carefully, understood every consequence, and accepted what it meant. Signing it would change more than personnel. It would turn reform from discussion into action that would cut directly through the structure of the Church itself. For a moment, he hesitated. Just 4 seconds. Not longer. Then he signed his name. At that exact moment, something irreversible began. By dawn, every cardinal in Rome would know what had been decided. Every faction inside the Church would begin interpreting the meaning of that signature in its own way. Some would see it as courage finally taking form after years of hesitation. Others would see it as punishment, delivered without warning. And for those whose names were on those pages, it would feel like exile, not announced, not debated, but simply imposed. But what Leo had set in motion was not limited to individuals. He was moving an entire system. What looked like a simple administrative list would soon expose deeper financial irregularities, trigger resistance from conservative circles, force formal theological objections, and lead to emergency meetings at the highest level of the Church. It would divide the Vatican in a way that could no longer be hidden behind tradition or silence. At 6:14 in the morning on June 1st, the first call came. Inside Vatican City, Cardinal Pietro Parolin's private phone rang before sunrise. It was not the kind of call that came through normal channels. In the Vatican, urgent matters were usually delivered slowly, carefully, and indirectly. A note, a visit, a quiet message through an assistant. But this bypassed everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Archbishop Edgar Peña Parra, the substitute for General Affairs. In Vatican hierarchy, he was one of the most powerful figures after the Secretary of State, someone who normally carried himself with calm control. But that morning, his voice carried tension. "Have you seen the list?" he asked. Parolin did not ask which list. He already understood that something had moved before the system had time to contain it. Within minutes, a sealed envelope was delivered to his residence. No explanation, no memorandum, no background note. Just the document itself. Parolin opened it at his kitchen table. He read it once, then again, slower, as if repetition might alter its meaning. It did not. The same 12 names appeared, each one tied to a senior position inside the Church's governing structure. Each one now marked for immediate reassignment. No consultation had taken place. No warning had been issued. No appeal mechanism was mentioned anywhere in the text. Parolin lowered the paper and sat in silence. The room felt heavier than before. Vatican reshuffles were not unusual. Transfers, quiet removals, and administrative changes happened regularly. But this was different. This was not routine governance. This was a coordinated rupture. He picked up the phone again and called Cardinal Kevin Farrell. The question he asked was simple. "Have you been contacted?" Farrell's response confirmed what Parolin already feared. A deputy had received notice just 20 minutes earlier. He was being transferred to Nairobi, effective June 15th. No discussion, no warning. The destination mattered less than the method. In the Vatican, even distant postings carried meaning. But the speed and silence of this decision signaled something larger than normal administration. Within the next hour, the scale of the action became clear. 12 officials had been reassigned simultaneously across 6 different dicasteries, touching nearly every major function of the Church's internal governance: doctrine, bishops, clergy, finance, communications, and the protection of minors. Each department represented a different center of power. Together, they formed the operational core of the Vatican itself. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the system was under pressure. Phone lines between cardinals were overloaded. Nuncios called Rome asking for clarification. Bishops contacted diplomatic offices. Everyone was asking the same question in different languages, but with the same urgency. What is happening? And somewhere inside the papal apartment, the answer was already forming into the next stage. By 9:30 in the morning, the uncertainty had already turned into pressure that could no longer be contained inside private conversations. The papal apartment became the center of gravity for a Vatican that was now trying to understand a decision it had not been prepared for. Cardinal Pietro Parolin was summoned for a private audience, and the way the meeting was arranged already signaled something important. There would be no assistants in the room, no secretaries taking notes, and no diplomatic buffers to soften what was about to be said. It was direct, immediate, and unfiltered. When Parolin entered, Pope Leo XIV was already standing behind his desk. He was not seated, not reading, not preparing any visible defense. His posture was steady, his expression controlled, and the silence in the room carried a weight that made formal introductions unnecessary. Parolin began carefully, choosing his words in a way shaped by years inside Vatican diplomacy. "Holy Father," he said, "there are serious concerns about the scope of these reassignments." Leo did not interrupt. He simply listened, as if the concern was expected rather than surprising. Then, after a pause, he responded with a single word: "Noted." It was not dismissal, but it was not engagement either. It created distance, a controlled boundary between the objection and the decision itself. Parolin continued, explaining what was already becoming clear across the Curia. 12 senior officials removed in a single day. Something that had not happened in modern Vatican history since major structural reforms decades earlier. He emphasized experience, service, institutional memory, and decades of diplomatic work that could not simply be replaced without consequence. Leo listened without changing his expression. When Parolin mentioned specific names, men who had served under multiple pontificates, Leo finally responded, not with emotion, but with administrative clarity. One of the officials, he said, would continue serving in Manila. The Church needed experienced diplomats in Asia. The tone was not defensive. It was final, as if the decision had already been integrated into a larger plan that did not require approval from the room. Parolin tried again, shifting the argument to perception. He warned that the reassignments would be interpreted not as governance, but as punishment. At that point, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Leo turned slightly toward him, and his voice lowered just enough to make every word sharper. "It will be seen as exactly what it is," he said. "Reform." There was no further elaboration, no justification, no expansion of argument. The conversation had reached its limit in terms of negotiation. The meeting lasted just over 20 minutes. When Parolin left, witnesses later said he appeared visibly shaken, moving directly back to his office, without stopping to speak to anyone. He closed the door and refused calls for the next hour, as if the weight of the exchange required silence before interpretation. But inside the Vatican, silence never lasts long. By mid-morning, the scope of the decision was fully visible. 12 simultaneous reassignments had now been confirmed across 6 major dicasteries, affecting doctrine, clergy discipline, financial oversight, communications, and internal governance. The structure of authority itself had been disrupted at multiple points at once. The Secretariat for the Economy was affected. The dicastery for bishops was affected. The dicastery for the doctrine of the faith was affected. Even offices related to communications and the protection of minors were included. This was no longer a single administrative adjustment. It was a coordinated restructuring that touched every sensitive nerve inside the Roman Curia. By 11 a.m., a second development followed. While the first wave of reassignments was still being processed, new orders emerged from the papal apartment. This time, they did not involve personnel. They targeted structure. Two internal committees that had existed for more than a decade were formally dissolved. One oversaw financial transparency and administrative review. The other provided doctrinal consultation before sensitive decisions reached the papal level. These were not public-facing institutions. They operated quietly inside the system, shaping outcomes without drawing attention. Their removal signaled something more significant than reshuffling people. It meant the pathways of influence themselves were being redesigned. In their place, a new institution was announced: the Pontifical Council for Institutional Integrity. It was a name that no one inside the Curia had previously encountered. It did not represent tradition. It represented construction, something being built rather than preserved. And then came the decision that changed the tone entirely. The new council would not be led by a cardinal, bishop, or cleric of any rank. Instead, Pope Leo XIV appointed Professor Maria Cristina Ferrara, a civilian legal expert with a background in international human rights law and anti-corruption investigations. Her appointment was not symbolic, it was structural. She was not chosen to represent the Church. She was chosen to examine it. Within hours, the reaction inside Vatican offices became more intense. The initial confusion turned into analysis, and analysis turned into alarm. A list of reassignments could be explained as discipline or restructuring. A dissolved committee could be framed as reform. But appointing a lay legal authority over institutional integrity suggested something deeper: a permanent shift in how accountability would function inside the Church. By early afternoon, the situation had already expanded beyond internal administration. It had become a question of direction. Was this reform, or was it a transformation of authority itself? And inside Rome, that question was no longer theoretical. It was now dividing the people closest to the Pope himself. By the time the early afternoon light settled over Rome, the Vatican was no longer reacting in confusion. It was reacting in formation. What had begun as uncertainty was now turning into alignment, with different figures inside the Church starting to position themselves based on what they believed Pope Leo XIV's decisions actually meant. Some saw necessary correction. Others saw a structural shift that went beyond reform and into something far more permanent. The first clear public reaction came from within the conservative theological current of the Church. Cardinal Gerhard Ludwig Müller, a former prefect of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, issued a statement that quickly circulated through Catholic media channels. His language was careful, but the meaning behind it was direct. He argued that governance in the Church could not be detached from sacred order, and that placing structural authority in the hands of lay experts, no matter how qualified, represented a break from established tradition. In his view, the issue was not competence, but theology. Authority, he insisted, was not simply administrative. It was rooted in ordained ministry. The statement did not name Pope Leo XIV directly in an aggressive way, but everyone reading it understood the target. Within hours, it had spread across Catholic networks and online platforms, where it became a reference point for a growing line of criticism. By mid-afternoon, informal coordination had already begun among a group of senior cardinals across different continents. The United States, Germany, Nigeria, India, and Brazil were all represented in private communications that were not officially declared, but clearly active. These men did not initially identify themselves as an organized bloc, but their alignment was becoming increasingly visible. Inside Vatican circles, someone eventually gave the group a name: the 12 Apostles. The irony was immediate, since it matched the number of officials who had been reassigned earlier that morning. At the center of this emerging network was Cardinal Raymond Burke, whose reputation as a legal traditionalist made him a natural focal point for resistance. Alongside him, Cardinal Robert Serra, though more reserved, was also drawn into the conversation, offering caution rather than confrontation, but still reinforcing concern about escalation. In private discussions, the language became sharper. One of the central arguments forming among them was that the speed of the reforms combined with the lack of explanation, risked destabilizing not only administration, but trust itself. The concern was no longer just about personnel changes. It was about the precedent being created. By late afternoon, the group began drafting what would later be described as a coordinated response. It was not yet public, but it was structured enough to signal intent. The tone was formal, careful, and rooted in canonical language. But beneath that structure was a clear tension. They were preparing to challenge the direction of the papacy without directly breaking from it. Outside these private exchanges, Rome itself was beginning to feel the emotional weight of the day. At the Pontifical Gregorian University, faculty members debated the implications in quiet but intense discussions. In seminaries, younger clergy tried to interpret what was happening without access to full information. In parish communities, rumors spread faster than official clarification. A retired Monsignor speaking in a small restaurant near Piazza Navona told a journalist he had lived in Rome for more than 4 decades and had never seen the church move this quickly in so many directions at once. That sentiment, repeated in different forms across the city, reflected a shared impression. Something had shifted, and it was still moving. Inside the Vatican itself, however, the atmosphere remained controlled. The papal residents did not issue explanations or clarifications. There were no press briefings expanding on the earlier decisions. Instead, silence was maintained, and that silence became its own source of tension. By early evening, the focus of attention shifted again, this time toward what was happening beneath the surface of governance. While public attention remained fixed on personnel changes, Pope Leo XIV was meeting privately with financial oversight officials and external auditors who had been working with the Vatican for several years. The meeting was not announced, and it did not appear on any public schedule. Present were senior officials from the Secretariat for the Economy and independent auditors from a global accounting firm that had been reviewing Vatican financial structures since 2024. The purpose of the meeting was not symbolic, it was investigative. Preliminary findings, discussed in that room, pointed toward a pattern that extended across multiple departments. It was not a single scandal or isolated misuse of funds. It was a network of irregular financial practices spread across different offices, involving budget adjustments, undocumented transfers, and consultancies that existed more in paperwork than in reality. The estimated figure discussed was approximately 47 million euros over a period of several years. But the emphasis in the room was not on the total amount. It was on the structure that allowed it to happen without detection or accountability. No one in the meeting was framing the issue as personal corruption on the part of specific individuals. Instead, the problem was described as systemic opacity, a governance environment where responsibility could be diffused, records could be incomplete, and financial flows could move through procedural gaps without clear oversight. Pope Leo XIV had seen the preliminary version of this report weeks earlier. He had not acted immediately. Instead, he had reviewed the findings, consulted privately, and waited before making a decision. That delay was not hesitation. It was calculation. At one point during earlier discussions, he had asked what would happen if the full audit were made public. The response had been immediate and cautious. It would trigger institutional shock, expose sensitive names, and potentially destabilize relationships beyond the Vatican itself. After a long silence, Leo had made a different choice. He would not release everything. He would move the people instead. It was a decision that shaped everything now unfolding. Reform would happen, but it would not be staged as public exposure. It would be executed through structural change. But that strategy depended on one thing: control of narrative. And by the next morning, that control was already beginning to slip. By the morning of June 2nd, 2026, the Vatican was no longer controlling the story. It was reacting to it. At exactly 6 a.m., a headline appeared on the front page of La Repubblica that immediately reframed everything that had happened the day before. The words were simple, sharp, and designed for maximum impact. Pope Leo XIV, the Great Purge. The phrase spread faster than any official clarification could catch up. It did not come from the Vatican. It came from outside interpretation, but once it entered circulation, it began shaping how every decision from the previous day was understood. What had been described internally as reassignment was now publicly being labeled as removal. What had been framed as reform was now being interpreted as consolidation of power. The article cited unnamed Vatican sources and described the 12 reassignments in detail. It went further than the Vatican itself had chosen to go, connecting the personnel changes to internal financial irregularities. That single connection changed the nature of the crisis. It was no longer just administrative restructuring. It had become a story about corruption, accountability, and internal conflict. Within hours, the Vatican press office issued a brief statement. It confirmed that reassignments had taken place under the authority of the Holy Father, but it did not explain why. It referenced canonical authority and formal governance structures, but it avoided any mention of financial audits or internal findings. The absence of explanation created a vacuum, and that vacuum was immediately filled by interpretation. Supporters of Pope Leo XIV described the move as necessary modernization, a long overdue correction of internal inefficiencies. Critics described it as centralized control, arguing that the speed and scope of the decisions reflected an unprecedented concentration of authority. By midday, the story had expanded beyond Italy. It was now global. Major international media outlets picked it up almost simultaneously. CNN focused on the historic nature of an American pope taking decisive administrative action inside the Roman Curia. BBC framed it through institutional governance and questions of transparency. Al Jazeera emphasized global Catholic demographics and the impact of Vatican decisions on Africa and Asia. European outlets focused heavily on financial accountability and structural reform within religious institutions. Each version of the story was different, but all of them were built around the same core event, and none of them were built around the Vatican's own explanation, because the Vatican had not provided one. That gap became the defining feature of the crisis. In Africa and parts of Asia, a different concern began to emerge. Several of the reassigned officials had been transferred to postings in those regions. While such appointments were not unusual in normal Vatican practice, the timing created a perception problem. If these were routine assignments, why did they coincide with such a sweeping internal restructuring? The Nigerian Bishops' Conference issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about how African postings were being perceived internationally. The language was diplomatic, but the implication was clear. The perception of exile was beginning to attach itself to what the Vatican intended as administrative movement. Inside the Curia, the pressure was no longer abstract. It was operational. Cardinal Parolin, Cardinal Tagle, and Archbishop Paul Gallagher were summoned for an emergency meeting with Pope Leo XIV. The group represented the diplomatic and administrative core of Vatican governance. They were not opposition figures, but institutional stabilizers, men tasked with ensuring that internal decisions did not destabilize external relationships. Tagle spoke first, acknowledging the Pope's authority without question, but raising a concern that was becoming harder to ignore. The speed of the changes, combined with the lack of explanation, was generating instability not only inside the Church, but also across diplomatic channels. Gallagher followed with a more immediate concern. Two of the reassigned officials had worked closely on relations with China. Unofficial inquiries from Beijing had already been received, requesting clarification. In diplomatic terms, that meant the issue had already moved beyond internal church governance and into international relations. Parolin remained careful, but direct. He emphasized that nuncios in multiple countries were being asked for answers they did not have. Bishops, governments, and journalists were all seeking explanations, and Rome had not provided a unified message. The absence of clarity was now becoming its own message, and that message was being interpreted in increasingly unstable ways. Pope Leo XIV listened without interruption. When each had finished, he finally responded. "Instability," he said, "is the price of honesty." The sentence did not resolve the concerns in the room. Instead, it clarified his position. He was not treating the situation as a communications problem. He was treating it as a structural correction that would inevitably create disruption. He then informed them that he would address the College of Cardinals directly on June 4th. Until then, he asked for patience. The meeting ended without further confrontation, but the tension did not leave with it. That same evening, the situation escalated in a different direction. A letter began circulating among members of the College of Cardinals. It was not an internal memo or private communication. It was a formal document, written in Latin, and signed by 11 cardinals. The letter took the form of a Dubia, a set of formal theological questions submitted to the Pope requesting clarification on doctrinal and governance issues. In the Catholic tradition, a Dubia is not casual inquiry. It is a structured challenge, framed in respectful language, but carrying significant theological weight. The questions address the authority behind the reassignments, the legitimacy of the newly created Pontifical Council for Institutional Integrity, and the broader implications of placing structural oversight in the hands of lay experts. But it was the final question that changed the tone entirely. It asked whether Pope Leo XIV intended to alter the fundamental structure of church governance in a way that diminished the role of ordained ministry. The implication was direct, even if the language remained formal. It suggested that the reforms were not merely administrative, but potentially doctrinal in nature. The letter reached the Pope's desk late at night. He read it alone, in silence, without advisors or aides present. According to those close to the papal household, he read it twice. Then he prayed. No immediate response was issued. No public statement followed. But by that point, the situation was no longer waiting for clarification. It was already moving toward confrontation.